Infinity Workforce Solutions is proud to announce our Engage event is coming to you this year on your terms. Engage events consist of expertly designed interactive sessions that focus on business outcomes and specific challenges the trucking industry will face rolling into 2021. Topics covered include insurance trends and forecast, expert legal perspectives, future readiness by industry leadership, and risk mitigation into 2021. Specific business outcomes in focus are reducing your liabilities, establishing a first-class culture of safety, and improving communication with your remote employees. It's the fastest way to start preparation for 2021 while meeting with like-minded and strategically focused professionals like yourself. Note that this event is a no-sale zone, no gimmicks, no pitches, and absolutely no selling. As proof, this event provides professional development credits through NATME. So if you're a transportation professional seeking to redefine success at your company and make your job a little bit easier in the process, join us to find out why Infinity is the most referred business in the industry.
Good morning, everyone. It's November the 5th, 2020. Thank you very much, Jay, for that introduction and the upcoming boot camp event, November 17 through 20, 11:30 to 1:30. We're going to cover insurance issues in detail. We're going to go over best practices. We've got our legal professional attorney, Peyton Ng, will be there to go over litigation and defense strategies, as well as our client success rep. It's approximately about a $5,000 value. And thank you very much, Jay, for offering it to the viewers today, and I very strongly encourage you to accept Jay's invitation to that. So that being said, let's roll on with today's webinar. We've got a huge issue today, which of course is the ATRI top 10 results that they have done for the last 16 years. I want to make sure everybody knows about our platform, Infinity Workforce Solutions, which can provide up to 20% reduction in crash frequency through remote learning, 80% reduction in violations, 50% reduction in training costs. Those are big numbers. That's a big representation, but I will tell you that remote learning does in fact work, and it's a best practice in our industry. And I think Jay is offering the free invite. So if you want to participate in that, sign me up. Just click the yes button on either of those. 30-day complimentary access to the system. Thank you again for that, Jay. And for reference now, Jay didn't just start in this business. He and I have been working with each other for well over 20, 25 years. He has had a long-term commitment to our industry and the safety profession. So all that being said, I'm ready to get started with today's topic. And if you'll go to the next slide, please. My name is Mark Ray. I've been in this industry for over 35 years. Worked with Frozen Food Express the majority of those years, and I have faced some of the issues that $4 gallon diesel fuel, driver shortages, freight shortages, electronic logs, CSA, all those things. And I want to urge you today to exchange the information that Rebecca Brewster will be presenting relative to 2020. We've had quite a year in 2020. And I want to introduce our guest speaker today. Rebecca Brewster is the President and Chief Operating Officer of the American Transportation Research Institute. ATRI is the recognized absolute best research entity to serve our industry. They're a nonprofit organization, and their mission is to improve the trucking industry's safety, productivity, and I'm going to add profitability. They do a lot of work on where the costs are and best practices. She's been with the ATRI for 27 years. She's with the Public and Governmental Affairs Director for North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. She was a fleet analyst for Moen Inc. She's got a Bachelor of Science in English. So I want to make sure I say all my words correct, from Wofford College, and she's a fellow with the North Carolina Institute of Political Leadership. More important, she is the recent recipient of the Fleet Owner Magazine's 2016 Dozen Outstanding Women in Trucking, the 2013 Influential Women in Trucking Award, and in 2010, the J.R. Bob Holliday Award given by the 50 State Trucking Association. So she's very well recognized, very well, have a number of recipients. So all that being said, let's get going. I've got a couple of questions for Rebecca before we get into the PowerPoint. Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning, Mark. Thanks for having me today.
Hopefully I pronounced my words correctly so far. As president of ATRI, I'm sure you get plenty of opinions and input on the industry, on the issues that we face. Did the results that you have seen in the 2020 survey obtained this year provide you or your staff any surprises?
Well, there were some surprises, and quite frankly, given what we've been through as a nation and really as a world this year with the pandemic, I was, first of all, surprised to not see COVID-19 pop into the top 10 like I thought it might. It was one of the issues that respondents to the survey could select. But the other real big surprise for us at ATRI was the escalation in ranking of FMCSA's Compliance, Safety, and Accountability, CSA. Really surprised to see it in this year's survey rise up from number 8 last year to number 4 this year. And I've got some information that I'll share on why we think that is, but that was one of the big surprises for us.
Well, yeah, it was a big issue when it came out 10 years ago. So I can't wait for us to cover that and see what as what you've got to say. The other comment I would ask you to comment on is as emerging issues. Motor carriers obviously are seeing insurance premiums and coverage as a high priority ranking this year, and our professional drivers have indicated that parking is at the top of the concerns out there. These issues are very easy to identify, but very difficult to solve. So my question is, do you see the insurance issue that the motor carriers are seeing and the parking issues that our professional drivers are seeing as recurring? Was this a one-time blip, or what's your comment on those two issues?
Well, I'm going to start with the driver's top concern, truck parking. And it is an issue that we've seen in the top 10 for a number of years now because it impacts our driver workforce on a daily basis. And we'll talk about some of the challenges with truck parking. It is a difficult one to resolve. Certainly there are solutions out there, but at the end of the day, we simply do not have enough places for our professional drivers to get their required rest. The insurance cost and availability making it into the top 10 is not a surprise. We've certainly heard a lot about it, and it's been discussed by ATRI's Research Advisory Committee. But the fact that it cracked the top 10 for the first time now since our inaugural survey in 2005 really underscores how big of a deal this is. And so I've got some information on some of the research we've done into that I think will be helpful for folks today.
Thank you. So these probably aren't one-time blips. These are significant issues. They're going to take some very creative solutions to get behind us.
They are indeed, Mark. And really, I think one of the things I'd like folks to focus on, because it's hard to isolate any one of these issues by itself. There is so much interplay between the issues in the top 10 that are really reflective of all that we face in the trucking industry on a day-to-day basis.
Well, thank you for that answer. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll get started with to see the results of the 2020 survey.
Thanks so much, Mark. And again, I really appreciate the opportunity to join everyone today to talk about the trucking industry's top concerns. Next slide, Colin. If you are not familiar with ATRI, and I certainly hope you are, We are the trucking industry's not-for-profit research organization, and all the work that we do on your behalf is generally focused in the areas you see here. One of the hallmarks of ATRI is that we provide all of our research free of charge. And so the studies that I'll talk about today, the full report on the top industry issues for 2020 and previous years, are all available as free downloads from our website at truckingresearch.org. Pretty easy to remember. That's what we do, and that's where you can find us online. So I would encourage you after this presentation to visit our website, go to any of the research hot topic areas, which look a lot like the top industry concerns, and find and download the research that you would find most helpful for your business. Next slide. Just a little bit about ATRI's governance. We are governed by a board of directors made up of the CEOs of the organizations you see here. Judy McReynolds, who is the chair and CEO of ArcBest Corporation, is the ATRI Board of Directors chair. And we were very pleased to just welcome our newest board member, Brenda Neville, who is the president and CEO of the Iowa Motor Truck Association. Next slide. But our research advisory committee is really where the hard work gets done at ATRI. The men and women representing the organizations you see here are charged with annually identifying the top research priorities for the trucking industry to which ATRI can bring its expertise to bear. And certainly the results of the top industry issues survey each year is one of the big inputs to this group's deliberations on where those research needs are. So if you download the full report, you'll see that for each issue on the survey, there are recommended strategies that have been ranked by survey respondents for how to address those issues. And many of those strategies have to deal with research. And so it is the charge of the Research Advisory Committee to sort through that and figure out what we need to be focused on. Where are those top research needs that reflect what is presented each year in the top industry issues survey? What I love about this group is its diversity of representation in terms of the trucking industry. Not only do we have motor carriers represented, but we have professional drivers. We have both OIDA and the Teamsters represented. We have law enforcement, truck driver training schools, federal government, state government, local government. It really is a very diverse group of trucking industry stakeholders who, again, have one mission, and that is to figure out what research studies can be done to address the trucking industry's top needs. Next slide. So let's look at the results from this year's survey. Just as a reminder, this survey, we launched it in early September. It was open through mid-October. We had record participation in this year's survey, over 3,100 trucking industry respondents, fairly evenly split. About 42% were motor carriers, a little less than that were professional drivers, and the rest were other industry stakeholders. So this particular slide represents the overall results of that combined group, where the driver shortage was, for the fourth year in a row, the top trucking industry concern. The number out to the right of each of those issues is where it ranked in the previous year's survey. And so you can see driver compensation, the number 2 issue this year, came up 1 from last year. Truck parking, which Mark asked me about in the very beginning, rose 2 spots this year to be the number 3 overall concern, and we'll talk a lot about that. I mentioned our surprise here at ATRI was to see CSA come up from number 8 last year to number 4. And then rounding out the top 5, insurance cost and availability, which, as I mentioned, has not been on the annual top industry issue survey since 2005, which was the very first year we did this survey. Driver retention held on to its number 6 position. Tort reform had fallen off the survey after 2011, where it was at the number 8 issue, but it is back on, very closely related to the insurance cost and availability topic, and I'll go into some research on that as well. Certainly the pandemic-driven recession that we experienced this year, I think, is behind the economy rising up 2 positions from number 10 last year to number 8 this year. I was another one of those surprises, Mark, was to see detention and delay drop down from number 4 last year to number 9 this year. But we know, based on some research we've done this year, what's going on with detention, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the biggest sort of mover on the list this year was the hours of service rules, which were at number 2 last year, down to number 10 this year. And we know that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration issued a final rule this year that addressed, in many cases, what were the concerns that drivers and motor carriers had with the hours of service rules. So I think that was behind some of that drop. But I also think that the industry has, with the changes that have been implemented over the past several years to the hours of service rules, I think the industry has adapted to those rules and accepts them, and they are much less of a concern for everyone. Next slide.
So detention and hours, maybe some relief, maybe a little bit of relief on those huge issues, but taking their place is parking and insurance.
Right. And again, as you said, Mark, none of these are really easily solved. They are certainly things we need to focus on and commit our resources to dealing with, and that includes what we do at ATRI, committing the research to address these issues. But none of these are going to go away overnight. Next slide. So those were the overall results. This is what it looks like when we break out the responses from professional drivers on the left and motor carriers on the right. On the motor carrier side, driver shortage and driver retention are, once again, as they were in last year's survey, they're number 1 and number 2 issues. CSA, again, that surprise issue for me, its high ranking comes in at number 3. And on the motor carrier side, because they are the ones bearing the cost associated with insurance and rising insurance premium costs, as well as excessive litigation, ranked insurance cost and tort reform as their number 4 and number 5 issues. On the driver's side, truck parking. Again, drivers experience this every single day, this lack of available safe parking for drivers. And so it is their number 1 issue, followed by their pay. And it's interesting, when we did our very first survey in 2005, the driver shortage was number 2. Fuel costs were number 1 that year, but the driver shortage was number 2. The number 1 strategy to deal with the driver shortage was to raise driver pay. And so compensation, while it's a newer standalone issue to the survey, certainly has been a part of this survey for a long time. And then the drivers, again, because they are the ones who experience the impacts directly of that detention and delay, rank it as their number 3 issue. Next slide. So let's talk about the driver shortage, number 1 overall and number 1 for motor carriers. One of the challenges of our workforce is the age of our workforce. And so this is the latest data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it compares the age of our driver workforce to the construction industry, professional and business services, and the entire U.S. workforce. And what you see in the trucking industry is we're represented by the blue line there. We have the largest percentage of our workforce among those groups in the 45 to 54 year age range and in the 55 to 64 year age range. While we don't have the highest percentage of those four groups in the 65 and over, 6.1% of our workforce is 65 and over, our driver workforce. And certainly there's some good news in that. It means that we have an older, more mature, generally experienced workforce, and that's good. But the problem for us is that if you look at the left side of that bar chart, you see that we have the smallest percentage of our workforce in the 20 to 24 year age bracket. And so we know that as those of us who are on the right side of that graph begin to retire, we are not bringing enough young people into the industry to fill those seats in those trucks. Now, when you look at this year's report, certainly the number 1 strategy for addressing the driver shortage was to work with the federal government to open up an apprenticeship program such as is proposed in the Drive Safe Act that would, with a number of thresholds and criteria in place, open up interstate driving to 18 to 20-year-olds. And so that would begin to bridge that gap of folks who get out of high school, who are looking for a career, who might consider trucking, but who right now, absent the Drive Safe Act, are prohibited from driving interstate. Next slide. Driver compensation, number 2 issue for drivers. It is certainly, as I mentioned in the 2005, the very first survey we did, the top ranked strategy for dealing with the driver shortage was to raise driver pay. One of the ways we monitor driver pay and benefits is through our annual operational costs of trucking. We started this research in 2008. We are finishing the analysis on the 2020 report, so that one will be out very soon. But what we do for this research is we collect very detailed financial data from hundreds of motor carriers. We aggregate that, we analyze it, and we come up with an annual cost per mile to operate a truck and a cost per hour to operate a truck. We do that overall, and then we do it by sector. We do it by region of the country because the costs associated with operating a truck are different based on the sector you're in. Your equipment might be more expensive. You might pay your drivers more. But it also differs by where you operate in the country, which is why we do those different breakouts. Next slide. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the most recent operational cost of trucking figure, $1.82 to operate a truck. But the reason I put this in here specifically was when talking about the driver shortage and driver compensation. If you look across just this 5-year history here, you see that the driver wage cost per mile and the driver benefit cost per mile have continued to climb. And we know that's how fleets are responding to the driver shortage and to driver retention. They are paying more to not only entice new entrants to the industry, but to keep the good drivers that they do have. Next slide. Just another way to look at that data, here's a little more of a longitudinal look. And you can see that since 2012, we've seen the driver wage cost per mile increase 43%, and benefits are up 55%. And so fleets are, again, responding to the shortage by providing increased compensation and benefits for their drivers. Now, I mentioned early on that we had a fairly even split between motor carriers and drivers who responded to this survey. Little more on the motor carrier side than on the driver side. But you might think, well, it was just drivers who said compensation was a concern. And I would tell you that is not necessarily correct. We also had motor carriers who indicated that driver compensation is one of their top concerns. And I think this bar chart is reflecting that. There comes a point where you continue to raise driver pay and benefits, but you have something unforeseen like a recession brought on by a pandemic. It is very hard to walk people's pay back. And so I know that fleets are also concerned, what is the tipping point for driver pay that allows you to recruit and retain drivers, but doesn't get you stuck in a bind if the economy turns. Next slide. So certainly this year has been a big year, and it's had an impact on some of these top industry issue surveys, including the number 3 issue, truck parking. So just a little background on this particular research. Earlier this year, in conjunction with OIDA, we launched a survey to really identify how the industry was being impacted by the pandemic. And I was a naysayer for doing this survey. When my staff came to me with the idea, I said, people are far too overwhelmed with just figuring out how we're going to get through this pandemic to respond to an ATRI survey. But I was very wrong, because within just over 2 weeks, we had over 5,000 respondents. You can see that 77% of them were drivers. So just a great response to this survey. But with paying specific attention to truck parking, which is the number 3 issue, next slide, you can see that we had about 44% of the respondents said that truck parking was somewhat harder or much harder to find during the pandemic. Now, we know that part of that is driven by the fact that, particularly early on, a number of states closed their public rest areas. So we have an already constrained parking system for professional drivers, and we had states essentially taking out capacity because of their concerns over keeping the public rest areas cleaned and sending out people to clean them when the pandemic was first starting. And so I think that is reflected in our March survey respondents saying truck parking was somewhat harder or much harder to find. Also detention. Remember, I mentioned that detention had dropped down, and I was surprised, But we did see that in this survey, about a third of the respondents said that they were experiencing longer detention times. I think one of the features that was driving that is not only were we, the trucking industry, dealing with COVID-19, but our customer base was dealing with COVID-19. And so they likely had reduced staffing to work the docks, and that also increased the detention time. Next slide. We have at ATRI a truck GPS data set that is comprised of over 1 million trucks worth of GPS data that comes into ATRI in real time, and we do a whole host of analyses with this. This is what the truck parking situation looks like using that truck GPS data set. This is a public rest area in Indiana, and red indicates parked trucks. And so you would expect to see in the rest area parking lot, you would expect to see parked trucks. That's where they are supposed to be parked. But if you look at that closely, you will see on both sides of the interstate, on the entrance ramp and on the exit ramps to those rest areas, trucks are parked because they simply don't have enough space within the rest area to park. And so this is symptomatic of why you understand when they shuttered rest areas, what happens, because then all these vehicles have to go somewhere else to park. Next slide. And certainly the picture at the bottom there of trucks parked on the ramp is just a real world example of what that looks like when those rest areas are closed. And that's an unsafe situation for our professional drivers. They have a required amount of rest they're supposed to get. They need to be able to get that rest so they can be safer on the roadway. But when you have to park on a ramp, it is not a safe situation for you, the driver. It's not a safe situation for the vehicles that have to navigate around you. And it's certainly not good for our infrastructure because shoulders are not typically designed to hold the weight of commercial vehicles over extended periods of time. The other two are just signs that actually were pre-pandemic. The drivers have posted on social media sites of what they face when they get to customer facilities. And as I've put on this slide, do we wonder why we have a driver shortage when this is the kind of treatment that drivers receive when they get to some facilities? So when you as a fleet are thinking about what can I do about the truck parking situation, I can't build a parking lot for my drivers to park in as they go. But certainly you can talk to your customers about this situation, you know, charging your drivers to use the restroom or not even letting them use the restroom. And certainly this has been exacerbated during the pandemic as everyone sort of shut themselves in and did not provide our essential workers, our professional drivers, access to their facilities. So, you know, it's making sure that you engage in that dialogue with your customers to make sure they understand how hard it makes it for you to recruit and retain drivers when this is what your drivers experience at their facilities. Next slide. So I mentioned that CSA really surprised me that it was so high on the ranking this year. And I think this is really indicative of sort of what we as an industry have been through since CSA first came on the scene in 2010. And I have put here just 6 of the studies that we at ATRI have done on CSA, that we've done more than this. We have a bigger body of work than this. And certainly there have been many other studies, including the one done by the National Academies of Sciences, to really figure out what's working with CSA, what's not working, how can we improve on a system. And I was, quite frankly, so surprised by the high ranking of CSA this year, overall number 4, and then on the motor carrier list, number 3, that I actually reached out to some of the survey respondents who ranked it so high to say, you know, what's going on? What's driving this? And things we've done research on at ATRI, things like the crash accountability. We know that FMCSA has made permanent their crash preventability determination program, but it's not working for everybody because you have to submit those reviews through the data queue system. People are concerned about their peer group assignments. They're concerned about data that shows up on their scores that isn't from their fleet. And so there are issues with CSA that are driving its ranking back up. And so again, we've done a lot of work on CSA, and I would encourage you to check into these studies on our website. But but it was a surprise to me, but after talking to folks, I understand why it had that high ranking. Next slide. So I earlier mentioned the interplay between insurance cost and availability and tort reform, and certainly that bore out on the motor carrier ranking. And so let's talk a little bit about, first of all, insurance costs. Next slide. Again, from our most recent annual operational cost of trucking, this is the change year over year. Truck insurance premiums up 12% in last year's report. Over the past 5 years, we had seen that increase at about 18.3%, I believe is the increase we had seen. Next slide. But that doesn't tell the story quite as graphically as this does, because I think the smaller fleets are really, in many cases, bearing the brunt of insurance premium costs. And so you can see here that the smaller fleets in our data set in last year's report nearly just over 3 times, we're paying 3 times as much in premiums per mile than were the larger fleets. But these costs are hitting everyone. And certainly the larger fleets are in a better position to do things like higher deductibles, which would bring down their cost per mile that smaller fleets are not able to do. Next slide. And one of the big drivers of the increased insurance cost availability, and certainly a outcome of the lack of tort reform up to this point, is the growth in nuclear verdicts. And this particular study, which we released in June, was the #1 research priority identified by our Research Advisory Committee in 2019. So to do this research, we pulled together a database of 600 cases, truck-involved crash cases spanning 15 years, a lot of data associated with each of those crashes. We also did a number of interviews with attorneys on both sides of the equation, both trucking industry defense attorneys as well as plaintiffs' attorneys. We talked to a lot of insurance industry experts and motor carrier safety experts. Next slide. So looking at sort of what's the landscape the litigation landscape we've been facing as an industry. And so you see here from 2010 to 2018, where the average verdict in a truck-involved crash in our database was over $1 million. We've seen a 967% increase in the average verdict size. Next slide. Just looking at cases where the verdict was $1 million or more, and these are not necessarily all nuclear verdicts. I'll get to the nuclear verdict piece of this, but just cases where the verdict was $1 million or more in our data set, you can see a 235% increase in the number of cases in the early years of our data set, 2005 to 11, versus the latter years of our data set, 2012 to 2019. So big growth in the number of cases where the verdicts are starting to creep up. Next slide. But in talking in our qualitative interviews with attorneys on both sides and with insurance industry, we set the nuclear verdict threshold at 10 million or above. And so looking just at cases in our data set where the verdict was 10 million or more, you can see early years of the data set versus later years, we had a 92.9% increase in the number of cases where the verdicts were over $10 million. Next slide. One of the arguments for why verdict sizes are increasing is because healthcare costs have increased. So addressing the healthcare issues of those in those crashes is more costly, and so therefore the verdicts are going up. So this particular chart compares growth in verdict size, which is the blue line, and the axis for that is on the left, versus growth in inflation and healthcare costs, and the axis for those is on the right. And you can see healthcare and inflation increases are below 7%, whereas on the verdict size, it's at 500% annually. So there simply is no rationalization that you can make saying that these are going up simply because of the cost of healthcare. Next slide. A lot of great quantitative analysis went into this study, and I'm really very proud of our staff for all the analytical work. So, for instance, when we looked at our database and the crash involved a traumatic brain injury, the average verdict was $6.7 million. If there was no traumatic brain injury, the average verdict size was $2.7 million. Next slide. Where we really saw a big difference was when children were involved in the crash. When children were involved, the average verdict size, $42 million. No children involved, $2.3 million. Now, you could say, well, Rebecca, that's interesting, but there's nothing I can do about the fact that children may or may not be involved. And that's true. But what you can use this quantitative analysis for is to better prepare yourself and understand your risks before going into court, so that if the crash involves a traumatic brain injury, you know what you're up against. And as you're talking with your insurance carrier and your defense attorneys about analyzing whether to go to court, take the case to court, or whether to settle, understanding what your risks are makes you make better informed decisions about which path to take. Next slide. The type of crash had an impact on the average verdict size. And you can see here that where the crash involved a spin or a roll of the vehicle, the average verdict size was almost $14.7 million. Next slide. And we found among the data set that certain factors that were brought against the defendant had an impact on the plaintiff's success in that case. And so in 5 instances, if it involved an hours of service violation or a logbook issue, if there was a driver history file issue, if the crash involved controlled substances, if your driver left the scene of the crash or failed to call 911, or if there was a health-related issue, all 5 of those had 100% of the verdicts go in favor of the plaintiff. So again, understanding what you are up against when you are involved in a crash empowers you to make much better decisions about whether to settle or to take the case to court. Next slide. If you are considering whether or not to call a expert witness to help your defense, we found that in quantitative analysis that makes a difference. You can see that when the defense called an expert witness, the average verdict size decreased by $839,000. So while you might be concerned about the cost of paying for an expert witness up front, certainly the outcome, I think, justifies that on the backside in decreased verdict size. Even, we found, even when the plaintiff side called an expert witness, if the defense side also had an expert witness, we still saw the average verdict size decrease by over $300,000. Next slide. I mentioned that we did a number of qualitative interviews, and again, both with defense attorneys and with plaintiff's attorneys. And that thorough risk analysis is so critical, and that's where I think this research really makes an impact for motor carriers. Settle early, settle often, but truly, lawyers on both sides said, where you can come with a reasonable settlement offer, your outcomes are much better. We had several plaintiffs' attorneys tell us that nothing is worse than the defense coming with a really low-ball settlement offer. They said in many instances that just is a no-go. They'll just close the books up, take you to court, and you'll end up paying a lot more than if you really understand, again, empowered by the data in this analysis, what you're up against, and making a reasonable settlement offer. That third bullet point came out of the interviews, and I think really, given what we have experienced in the pandemic, I think is working in our favor these days. When we can make the jury understand just how critical the trucking industry is, and more specifically, how much of a valuable asset to that community the trucking company is, the trucking driver is, and what value member of the community they are, that makes a big difference. And no time since I've been in the industry 30 plus years, have I seen that play out more than during the pandemic when everyone realized suddenly, my gosh, if I'm going to hoard toilet paper and hand sanitizer, I need the trucking industry to deliver that. And they really are our heroes delivering everything we need. And so I think we are in a good position as we are on the backside of this pandemic, hopefully, to see that favorable impression of the trucking industry play out among jury pools. Next slide. So I mentioned the connection between tort reform and motor carrier cost, specifically insurance cost and availability. And in our research, of course, we documented these nuclear, this increased litigation against the industry is having an impact on overall motor carrier costs, specifically in the insurance. We know that the insurance companies are increasing the premiums. Their underwriting standards are much stricter. They're more selective in who they insure. And this plays out across all fleets, whether you're involved in these crashes or not. Ultimately, all fleets are paying to cover the losses associated with these large crashes or cases and verdicts. And we know that there are carriers who are closing their doors because of insurance costs and not being able to bear the increased cost of insurance. Next slide. A great way to really connect the dots for people who might not understand the tie-in between what you and I pay at the store for whatever it is we're going to consume and these large verdicts. Because when the industry gets hit with these large verdicts, insurance companies have to raise their premiums to cover the costs. Motor carriers have to raise the cost of shipping things to cover those if they are able to do so. And that increased transportation cost just means at the end of the day, we all pay more for our consumer goods. Next slide. So certainly our research advisory committee, cognizant of the 2019 top industry issues and the work that we had done when they met earlier this year, identified the 2020 top research priorities and again focused on insurance costs and tort reform. You can see that their top study that we're working on now, top ranked study that we're working on now, is to look at the impact of small verdicts. So we've done a very good job with these larger verdicts. In this particular study, we're looking at verdicts and settlements of less than $1 million. And so following a similar methodology, we've pulled together a similar data set. And again, it will be very data rich to provide you with guidance on what you need to do to deal with these cases as they come along and ultimately, hopefully prevent them. Another one that I'll just point out is the owner-operator independent contractors in the supply chain. Now we know out in California just on Tuesday, legislation passed that would allow Uber and Lyft to stay out of the employment classification situation they were in. So that is a positive thing because the trucking industry also operates with a lot of owner-operators and independent contractors, but there's not a lot of great information out there, research, data-based information about why individuals choose that pathway, how it benefits the industry, and more importantly, what would happen if that employment model were to disappear? What would be the impact on the supply chain? What would be the impact on the trucking industry? So we're have that one underway as well. Next slide. So that's a snapshot of the top industry issues and our research on your behalf focused on those issues. But I hope that that entices you to be a participant in ATRI's research, because as I always tell people, more is better when it comes to data and our research. And so I hope that the next time you see a data call or a survey put out by ATRI, you'll take the time to participate, whether it's in our operational costs of trucking, our top industry issues surveys. Oftentimes we'll put out surveys that are focused on drivers, specifically to deal with an issue like our detention work. And so I hope that if you are a fleet, you will encourage your drivers to participate. And we're always looking for new research ideas to be considered by our research advisory committee, and those can be sent to us through our website at truckingresearch.org. Next slide. I will tell you that a great way to support our research agenda is to support us financially. ATRI is a 501c3 not-for-profit research organization. And so all the studies that I've described here today are all done with charitable contributions. And as I like to say, certainly no contribution is too big, but no contribution is too small. We receive $25 checks from professional drivers. And to me, that's very gratifying because it tells me that they value the work we do on their behalf. Next slide. So Mark, there's my contact information. I hope that answered some questions, but I'm certainly happy to take some more.
Okay, well, I'll leave that up there for a couple of minutes. I would just comment those numbers on the nuclear verdicts are breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking. The other comment I would make is, you mentioned the surprise in the interest in CSA, the renewed interest in CSA, and I wonder if part of that is the motor carriers saying, we've invested, we have invested time and money and effort into CSA, and maybe we're not getting the return on the investment relative to improved insurance premiums. Just a thought.
No, I think it's a very valid point. And, I think when CSA first came out in 2010, I think the industry was very supportive because FMCSA has limited resources. Everyone understands that. So a system that would help them better target their resources to focus on those that need the most improvement, I think we can all agree with that. But as we documented in some of our research, the disconnect between your safety performance in a certain basic and your basic score and the ability of those basic scores to predict safety performance, there were some disconnects there. And the system has been tweaked overall. But again, as a system to evaluate how you're doing relative to your peers still creates some concerns for people. Bad data in means bad data out. And so, when I made calls to carriers who ranked it so high, they frequently referenced crashes, violations, other items that showed up on their CSA scores that had nothing to do with their fleet. And so there's a lot of still issues and concern with CSA.
And again, what's the return? What do I get for that? And these nuclear verdicts are covering all that up, obviously. So, well, let me ask you one more question. I know this came out last week. It's new on the press. What feedback have you gotten from the industry on the 2020 responses?
Well, certainly there is a lot of concurrence that the driver shortage is number one. There are those who will say there is no driver shortage, it's a driver compensation issue. But we see those issues very closely linked in the ranking. So, which came first, the shortage or the compensation issue? I won't argue. So I think certainly on the motor carrier side, I think it's very reflective of their concerns. And I think drivers, from what I've heard from drivers that I've spoken to since we've come out, appreciate the fact that truck parking went up from number 5 to its highest ranking it's been on the survey to number 3. It's number 1 on the driver list, but it's number 3 overall. I think they are very appreciative of the fact that everyone is starting to recognize how big of an issue this is for the industry because it impacts everything. For instance, it impacts industry productivity. It impacts my hours of service because in previous truck parking research we've done, we documented on average about an hour a day that drivers give up of productive driving time because they're going to go ahead and park now because they're afraid they're not going to find a place to park down the road. And so that starts to add up across drivers, across fleets, and across the industry just from that lack of available parking.
Yes, and just the focus on that issues, some parallels to the detention issue that's dropped down to 9. Some relief, but it's not going to come without some creative solutions. So let's go to the next slide, please. Here's just a quick overview of the Infinity Workforce Solution customer base. I want to also just do a quick shout out to Jeremy Reimer with Driver Reach, who is helping us develop a workforce of CDL drivers out there to offset that driver shortage. We've got people all across the nation here, obviously. I also want to extend, if we can go to the next slide, please, the invite for participating. Well, that's just me. That's my contact, and Rebecca again. We do have a 30-day, there we are. If you want, this is a quick, if you'd like to register for the Engage event that we talked about earlier, that's the 17th through the 20th, just plop in a yes. We'll get right back with you. I very strongly encourage you to do that. We're going to dig into some more of the details of the issues that Rebecca brought up today with insurance, risk assessments, best practices that are out there. If you would like free access to remote safety training for your drivers, hit a yes here. We can get you set up this afternoon on that 30-day free trial from, thank you again for that, Jay. And if you want to be contacted by Rebecca, just answer yes on the poll and we will get right back with you. Some really, really good information today. I again would encourage you to share this information not only with your driving staff, but your non-driving staff, for the very simple reason these issues are there for a reason. There are not simple solutions to these problems. These nuclear verdicts, the parking issue, we're just going to have to grind it out. We as an industry faced multiple issues in 2020, and as expected, we're able to overcome them. So thank you for that very much. And we'll go to the next slide. I want to see what questions we've got. I've got one question here, Rebecca. Impact on the industry, on the driver shortage from the clearinghouse. Did you want to comment on that?
Certainly. So we've seen the numbers come out of FMCSA, 40,000 drivers who have been disqualified because of the clearinghouse. And
did you say 30,000?
I believe that was the last number I saw. And certainly that was the intent of the clearinghouse, was to identify drivers who tested positive for drug use. The challenge for us in terms of the shortage is a large percentage of those drivers have not even started the return to duty process, which there is a process to return to work. But if they are not even starting that process, it's probably a good indicator that they are going to not return to the industry. Now, when you think about just on Tuesday, the number of states that joined the ranks of those that are legalizing marijuana use, whether it's medical or recreational, I think this is going to continue to be a shortage issue for us, if you will, because we will see individuals who might want to go into a trucking career who are in a state where use of marijuana is legalized, who don't connect the dots between what I do on the weekend legally in my state and then my ability to pass a pre-employment drug screen. I think is going to be a continuing challenge for us in terms of building out our workforce.
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. The decision to use recreational marijuana disqualifies you from operating a commercial vehicle. It's right. pretty simple, and that obviously takes away from the population that's out there. We've got a number of questions about getting a copy of this slide today, and the answer is yes. We will have a replay. There will be slides available for everyone. So don't worry about that. We'll get back with everybody on that. I don't see any other questions. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I again want to thank Rebecca and her staff for the research you've done and I will tell you, I have personally used ATRI research in litigation to defend us in the court of law because of the work you've done. So it's absolutely important to continue what you're doing out there. We're looking forward to the work you're going to do with CSA, obviously, and truck parking. Who knows? I don't know what the solution to that is, but it's an issue. We didn't know the answer to detention either, did we? So
That's right.
we just got to roll our sleeves up and get to work on that. Okay, well, we will conclude today's webinar on the ATRI Top 10. And I want to thank Rebecca for the time you've invested with your staff pulling all this information together. Thank you again, and we will see everybody next month. Thank you. And if you do want to participate in the Engage event on the 17th through the 20th, I strongly encourage you. We'll have insurance, we'll have lawyers, we'll have best practices. It's a really good opportunity. Thank you very much, and we will see you next time. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.